So I'm Madison Miner. I'm the founder of Wom Mobile, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about, as you might guess by the title of the slide, some things that you can't believe that you can do with AMP, but you actually can.
Yeah, and hi, I'm Sebastian. I'm a developer advocate at Google, and I'm going to talk about what's possible if you really push the format.
Thank you. So a little background about Wom Mobile and how we got here. Wom Mobile's been doing nothing since 2010 except for optimizing the web for mobile. And as you can imagine, performance has always been a huge focus for us. So when we first heard about AMP, we got really excited. And we dove in and started playing with it. And the very first thing we did was try to create an e-commerce AMP, which was a bit of a challenge. But we got it to work. It was a pretty simple e-commerce page. It didn't show up in the lightning bolt or with the lightning bolt of trust yet. But it was AMP. It was very fast. It allowed you to configure a product. And it integrated with the existing site's checkout system. So we thought it was a success, and we really enjoyed it. Since then, we've developed over 500,000 e-commerce AMPs. And the results for our clients have been tremendous. But it hasn't always been smooth sailing. Through this journey, we've encountered a lot of skeptics. We've talked to clients and potential clients and other developers that have said things like, AMP just adds another step to the buyer journey, or you really can't build interactive, highly functional e-commerce pages with AMP, or that AMP was just for news publishers, and it really wasn't ready for e-commerce. And so what we'd like to do today is dispel all those myths and really show some examples of how we've created rich, interactive experiences with AMPs. And so the point of today's talk is really not to showcase or describe the best way to create a specific piece of functionality, but really show that you don't need third-party JavaScript, and you can build a lot of functionality just with HTML and CSS if you're willing to think outside the box. And some of the solutions I'll show today, thanks to improvement in AMP, there's now easier ways to do them, but we still wanted to present them just to really prove that not only is AMP ready for primetime e-commerce now, but it really always has been. I'm going to share 4 solutions. The first is a tabbed interface. The second is a full-screen modal error. The next is a voting mechanism. And the last is a payment system, actual checkout system built into AMP. We're going to dive into the code and kind of show the details of how these are created. The first 3 are in production today and live in our client sites. The last one's under development and will be live soon. And instead of showing any one of our client sites and really picking on our clients too much, we decided to build our own store just for this conference to include all of these solutions in one AMP page just to make it easy to share. And we really thought about what should our store sell? What's an appropriate product? And we decided on a cycle with no breaks. We wanted it to be nice and fast, so we created Amped Up Kids. So our store sells one product, which is a cycle with no breaks. The first one we'll jump into is tabs. Tabs are a very common interface you see all over anytime you're using a computer. But it wasn't readily apparent how to create tabs in AMP. And we saw a few requests for this on the GitHub channel and a few requests from other developers, so we thought it'd be worthwhile to share. On the left, we just kind of outlined the tabs so it's clear what's happening. And on the right, you can see our user tabbing through the About section, the reviews, and the warranty. So the code for this is actually pretty simple. Sorry about the black background. Next time I do this, I will put my code on a white background. Hopefully you can read it. But we have a tab container that is using an AMP selector. The selector contains 3 groups of divs. Each group contains a button and a tab content. You can see on the right how this would typically lay out in a HTML document, which is not very tab-like. However, by adding just a bit of CSS, we're using Flexbox here, which we love and use in a lot of our AMPs. We can move all of the content blocks below all of the divs. The key here is, it's hard to tell it's highlighted, but the order property of the Flexbox that we're applying to the content divs that moves all of the content elements below our tab elements. Here we're setting it to 4, which is the number of options plus 1, and that'll move them all to the end. So it now looks like this, which is pretty close to the typical tab interface. Now all we have to do is hide all the elements and only show the content area that is associated with the selected button. And Tab Selector is nice enough to make that very easy for us. Oops. AMP Selector, wrong button, sorry. So here, we're setting all the contents to display none by default, except for if the content block is immediately followed or preceded by a selected button. AMP Selector, when you tap on any option inside of an AMP Selector, it will add the selected attribute to that element. So here, by tapping on a button, it adds a selected attribute, which shows our content for the correct tab. And you can use this same pattern for all types of different interactions. Here, simply by swapping out the order of the flexbox, we have moved all the content areas above the buttons. The buttons in this case are color swatches. And the effect is that when you tap on a color swatch, you can scroll through the content area, which is using an AMP carousel, to view images of the product in that color. And you can tap the different colors and swipe through the images. A very common e-commerce experience, all done with no third-party JavaScript. Another way to do this, which we're really excited about, is AMP bind. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that, because we're going to learn more about it soon. But with AMP bind, you could make this a type of interface even more powerful, and that'll be really neat. So now we've got a really cool color selector, but what happens if the user orders a product that's out of stock? We wanted to have a very prominent error message that the user had to dismiss before continuing. And again, it wasn't readily apparent how to create this in AMP, so we thought we'd share. Here you can see the effect, where when the user tries to order a blue tricycle, is it not playing? Oh, there we go. The error message is displayed. So the way this works is we're using AMP form. And with each AMP form, you get 2 templates you can work with based on the response of when the form is submitted. Here we're using a success template to continue and an error template to display an error message if the product's out of stock. Our error template contains a full screen div, which is followed by a full screen label, which is invisible but will receive all the clicks on the screen. The label is associated with a checkbox, which immediately precedes our full screen div. And then we have some CSS that will hide the full screen div when the checkbox is checked. The effect is that by tapping anywhere on the screen, you tap the label, which checks the checkbox, which then hides the div. This is a fairly common hack. It's called the Check Box Css Hack. And here we're using it to dismiss a modal when it is displayed. Again, you can see it here. When the error message is displayed, they can tap anywhere on the screen and dismiss the error message. Again, thanks to improvements in AMP, we could have achieved the same thing using the form's on attribute, listening for a submit success event, and then displaying an AMP lightbox. If we were doing that, we would not need to use the checkbox CSS hack, but there's still lots of applications to use the checkbox CSS hack. In fact, we could have done the tabbed interface with the same, instead of using AMP selector, using the checkbox CSS hack. So next we'll dive into is a review mechanism. Reviews are very popular online. You might have reviews just to increase user engagement because people like to vote on things or determine which image is the most popular. Here we're using reviews to, or voting to determine if a review is helpful. Here you can see when the user taps on the thumbs up icon, It will update the form, give them a new count, and give them an indication that their vote was successfully cast. It looks pretty simple, but there's a fair amount going on. Here we're using AMP list to pre-populate the form. AMP list downloads some JSON, which includes the number of votes for and against the review. That gives us our initial state. Our thumbs up icon is a label, which is associated with a radio button. When you tap on the label, it checks the radio button. And both of those two are nested inside a button, which seems a little weird, but we've tested this, and it works in all major browsers. The effect is that when you tap on the label, it checks the checkbox. That event then bubbles up and clicks the button, which submits the form. So with one tap, you're completing all of this. The form then posts to the server, casts your vote. The server responds with a success message, and the form updates showing the success template, which is absolutely positioned over the original form so that the user can't vote again, and they get an indication that their vote was cast, and they see the number of votes update. Here we can see it again when they tap on the thumbs up. It checks the radio button. Oops, got ahead of myself, sorry. When they tap on the thumbs up, it checks the radio button, bubbles up, clicks the submit button, submits the form, and then we have an updated success template. Again, thanks to improvements in AMP, we could have achieved this without nesting a radio button inside a button by using the radio button's on attribute to listen for a change event and then submit the form to accomplish the same thing. These types of interactions are constantly getting easier and easier in AMP. Next one we want to talk about is actually building a payment system inside of AMP, a checkout system. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. This one won't actually work until Chrome 57 is released, but that should be in the next week or two, so it's pretty close. We have this under development now and are really excited to launch it. This is using the browser's new payment request API from an AMP page to allow a user to check out directly from the AMP page. Here again, we're using a form, and inside the form, we have a submit success template. And this template contains an iframe, which downloads a document that contains the JavaScript, which runs the payment request API. An important note here is this only works if the allow payment request attribute is on the iframe. And AMP is now allowing that, so that's valid AMP. However, if the AMP document is inside another iframe, as in Google Search, as we just discussed during the panel, or was discussed during the panel, will load AMPs inside of Google using an iframe. That iframe inside Google also needs to have the allow payment request attribute. And Google has committed to adding this, and it will be rolled out soon. So soon, this will all work well. So one thing you can't do with AMP is use the templates, the success templates or the error templates to change the source of an iframe. So we cannot pass a user ID or the order quantity or color or items like that through the query string. So instead, we have to keep track of the user through a cookie. The way this works is when the user clicks the buy button, that posts the order information to the server stores it, returns a 200 response message that contains a cookie. The cookie is stored on the phone. When the AMP framework sees the success message, it renders the success template. The success template contains the iframe. When the iframe makes its request to the server, the cookie is present. So the server can recognize the user and display the proper payment request information. Here we see the user go from ordering 1 red trike to ordering 2 pink trikes, and the payment request API correctly reflects the user's order information. Now, we're really excited about this because, like I mentioned, we've built a lot of e-commerce AMPs, and we've seen excellent conversion rate analytics. And it'll be really interesting to see when you combine super frictionless, easy checkout that's possible from Google Search, what the conversion rate looks like. It removes all extra steps. It's one page from search that allows a configuration and a purchase. And we're really excited to launch this and see what happens. And now I will hand it over to Sebastian.
Yeah, Madison showed us some really great hacks that already work in the real world, and I decided to look a bit into the future and see what is really possible if you push the framework. And so I thought, when I was preparing this talk, like, what is the craziest thing you could try to implement with AMP? And you've seen the demo earlier that I decided to create a messaging app in AMP. And I set myself 3 goals. So the first one, it should have a working live message stream. You should be able to send and receive messages. The second one, it should have a dynamic UI. This means, like, whenever you click on something, you shouldn't have a full page reload. Instead, the UI should be snappy and responsive. And the third thing I wanted to accomplish is that it should be a really engaging experience. So it be a proper PWA. You should be able to install it to your home screen and even support push notifications because it's a messaging app. And apart from that, I set myself one rule: no iframes. Like, they are kind of the duct tape of AMP, and whenever something not supported, the answer is usually just use an iframe. Here, I don't want to use any iframes at all. So let's start with the live messaging stream. And so what we need is something that updates the AMP, like, more or less in real time. And in AMP, there's only one component that is capable of doing this, and it's the AMP live list component. And the AMP live list component is usually meant for, like, news articles which describe an ongoing event, and editors can post additional updates to the article. And how it usually works is that whenever there's a new update, a button appears, you press it to refresh the article. I mean, this is not really how you would expect a messaging app to work, because you expect messages to automatically appear. And that's also possible with live list. And how it works is, like, you have an existing item, and if it changes, you can update its timestamp, and it will update its content. So this is something we can use for building a messaging app. So the basic structure of our stream is we have the live list. Inside the live list, we have a list of messages which are rendered on the server. Then we have an AMP form, which we use to compose the messages and send it via an XHR request to the server. Now, this works quite well. However, there's one problem. That is, like, the way how AMP live list works is that it polls the server for new changes, and the minimum interval you can poll in is 15 seconds. So this means when I'm sending a message, I have to wait 15 seconds until it appears in my message stream, which is not really acceptable. So I tried to improve this, and it's actually quite easy if you're using AMP form. And the idea is to use the AMP form's capability to render a response inside the document. So at first we have our server-side rendered list of messages. Then we compose a message and send it, and then render the result, the updated message list, inside the AMP form's form success block. And at the same time, we have to make sure that we don't show, like, both versions of the message stream at the same time, so we hide the initial version of the messages. So that works quite well. So now we can send and receive messages, and when I send a message, the result will instantly appear on the stream. However, there's one problem. And so you start carefully crafting a new message, but when it takes you longer than 15 seconds, and a new message comes in between, the AMP live list will update and replace the form. So it's going to delete the content of your text input while you're typing, which is a very frustrating experience, I can tell you. So I tried to fix that as well, and this was a little bit harder. And it starts getting a little bit dirty now. So I decided to introduce a second form outside the AMP live list. And the form, when you submit it, it sends a message to the backend, but it doesn't render any response. Instead, we use the AMP form's capability to listen for the submit success event. And when this is fired, we trigger the other form to submit, which is embedded in the live list. And this does nothing except pulling in the new messages. I call it the cascading AMP form submit pattern. You probably shouldn't use it, but it works. And now we have a fully functioning messaging stream in AMP. And like, yeah, before you start looking weird at me and laughing, there's one thing you should consider about this. So we have a working messaging stream implemented with 0 lines of code. And this is a really good thing, because like no code, like the less code you write, the less likely you're to create any bugs in your application. And I think this is a really interesting aspect of AMP, that you can create quite complex patterns and interactions just by creatively combining the existing AMP components. Now let's go on to the second bit, creating a dynamic UI. And here it's like AMP bind is really helping here, and I'm really looking forward to using it more. And you see here at the sample, so we have 2 pages. We have the chat list, and we have a chat detail page. And we see we've got quite a few animations. So we have got a slide-in effect. The compose field appears from the bottom. The floating action button drops in. The title changes. So lots of things are going on in this app. And it's actually quite easy to implement this using the new AMP bind features. So the way it works is we have 2 pages, which are in the same document. And so the first one is the chat list, and it's initially shown. And then we bind the class of its class to a global state, in this case, a variable called active chat, which contains an identifier for the active chat, or -1 if no chat is active. And depending on its value, it's going to add the show or hide CSS class. And we do the same for the chat page. And here again, we check for a specific chat. And the trick is the way you implement a button to switch to a chat. There you declare an action, so to change the state to the specific chat. And this will trigger the changes in the class when you press on the button. And then again, I'm using normal CSS animations to perform the actual transition between the 2 pages in our application. So that works quite well. And now let's go to the last bit. So creating an engaging PWA. And the first thing I wanted to do is to support adding our messaging app to the home screen. And you know that on Chrome Android, you've got this built-in feature to add. So you get a dialog asking you whether you want to add this website to your home screen. And there are 2 things you need to do in order actually there are 3. First of all, your page needs to be served via HTTPS. The second thing you need to do is provide an app manifest, which describes the name of your application, icons, start URL, things like that. So this is fairly trivial to add. And the second one is adding a service worker. And in AMP, you have the AMP install service worker component, which you can use to install the service worker from your AMP. And this even works for cached versions. So if your AMP's loaded from the cache, it's going to install the service worker for your own domain, which is really powerful. And we use in our sample the service worker to cache page requests. So you can even use the app when you're offline. But now that we've got a service worker in place, we can also add an additional feature. And this is push notifications. The way web push notifications work are you need, first of all, a service worker. And the service worker needs to run in the background, so when your page is not active, so that it can listen to incoming notifications and then show a system notification. This is no problem, as AMP supports service workers. But the second thing is a little bit harder. So you need a little bit of client-side code in order to ask the user for the permission to send push notifications. And this is currently not supported by AMP. And so if you see it here in the demo, so this is the button at the top. So when you press it, a dialog appears which asks you to give the app the permission to send notifications. And this is currently not supported by AMP. However, there's a workaround we can use here. And it's quite a simple trick. We use a service worker which runs in the background, and you can use it to intercept page requests. And we do this, so every time you request a new page, we're going to fetch this page and then pass the response and add a tiny bit of JavaScript to the document that we need to enable the push notification. So the interesting bit of this is that this makes your AMP invalid. But that's not really a problem, because if your AMP is served via an AMP cache, and AMP caches don't support service worker, so these caches will never see the invalid version of your AMP. So it's really just a progressive enhancement for your AMPs if they are served from your own domain. I mean, you have to be a little bit careful with it, that you doesn't break with the AMP constraints. For example, AMP relies on knowing where everything is placed. So you shouldn't introduce objects which change the layout. So you should be careful with doing about that. But apart from that, that's definitely something you can do. And if you have this in place, it's actually quite easy to, you get a really great experience. So here's what it looks like. On your home screen, you get a system notification, and then it launches your app from the home screen directly into the chat view. And I think this is already using the new improved Add to Home Screen feature, which has been recently introduced as an experiment in Chrome. And I think it's a really fantastic integration. So if we now review what we've done so far, we actually accomplished to create a proper messaging app. We have a live message stream. There are a few quirks I'm not too happy about, but apart from that, the basic functionality is definitely there. We have a dynamic responsive UI, and it's a fully capable PWA, which includes push notifications. So I think it's definitely a great example for what is possible if you're using AMP. However, I'm not telling you now that you should build your next messaging app in AMP. We definitely shouldn't do this, because AMP is still a restrictive format. However, what I really want to show with this is that AMP is a lot more capable, as you might imagine, if you're creative in the way how you combine the existing AMP components. So that's my sample, and I hope you find a few more creative ways to build your apps.
Hope.